Hello and welcome to the finale, the conclusion, the resolution, part 10 of our read aloud of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We are here at the very, very end. We're going to jump right in. Aslan had killed the White Witch at the end of part 9 after bringing all of those revived statues back as reinforcements for his army. And now they are finishing off the battle. The good side has won. But now we need to see what happens after that. So let's go. The final chapter of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. The battle was all over just a few minutes after Aslan's arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or fled. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to her to see Peter as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone left and right, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards into a statue, and when he reached her, he had the sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand, instead of trying to go for her directly and simply getting made a statue himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have some chance. If we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him." They found Edmund in the charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood, his mouth was open, his face a nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end, and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while she was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face, wondering if the cordial would have any result. "Yes, I know," said Lucy crossly. "Wait a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice, "others are also at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" "I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him. And for the next half hour they were busy, she attending to the wounded while he restored those who had been turned into stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had seen him look, well, for ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go wrong. He had become his real old self again, and could look you in the face. And there, on the field of battle, Aslan made him a knight. "Does he know," whispered Lucy to Susan, "what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was?" "Hush, no, of course not," said Susan. "Oughtn't he to be told?" said Lucy. "Oh, surely not," said Susan. "It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if you were him." "Well, all the same, I think he ought to know," said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know. But somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. The next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river. And the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were the sands with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed, and the smell of the sea, and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls! Have you ever heard it? Can you remember? That evening, after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But the next day was more solemn and serious. For then, in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof, and the west door all hung with peacock's feathers, and the eastern door which opens right out onto the beach and the sea, in the presence of all their friends and to the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them on to the 4 thrones amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen in Narnia. "Bear it well, sons of Adam. Bear it well, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids, swimming close to the castle steps and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat in their thrones, and scepters were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, and to the beavers, and giant Rumblebuffin, to the leopards, and the good centaurs, and the good dwarves, and to the other lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed, and drinks flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing, came the music of the sea people. But amidst all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away. And when the kings and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He'll be coming and going," he had said. "One day you'll see him and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down. And of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know. Not like a tame lion." And now, as you see, this story is nearly, but not quite, at an end. These 2 kings and 2 queens governed Narnia well and long, and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest. A haunting here, a killing there, a glimpse of a werewolf one month and a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all of that foul brood was stamped out. And they made good laws and kept the peace, and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarves and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers, and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort from giant Rumblebuffin, across the north of Narnia when they ventured across the frontier. And they entered into friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them. Peter became a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior. He was called King Peter the Magnificent. Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage. She was called Queen Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, though great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always happy and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired her to be their queen. Her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. And so they lived in great joy. And if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year, many years passed, it fell out that Tumnus, who was a middle-aged fawn by now and beginning to become a bit stout in the middle, came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts. The white stag who would grant you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens, with the principal members of their court, rode a-hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods, to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they had sight of him, and he led them at a great pace over rough and smooth and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the advisers were tired out, and only these 4 kings and queens were still following. They saw the stag enter into a thicket where their horses could not follow. Then said King Peter, for now they talked in quite a different style, having been kings and queens for so long, "Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I never hunted a nobler quarry." "Sir," said the others, "even so let us do." So they dismounted and tied their horses to trees, and went on into the thick woods on foot. And as soon as they had entered it, Queen Susan said, "Fair friends, Here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron. Madam, said King Edmund, if you look well upon it, you shall see it is a pillar of iron, with a lantern set on the top thereof. Marry, a strange device, said King Peter, to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it, and so high above it, that if it were lit it should give light to no man. Sir, said Queen Lucy, by likelihood, when this post and this lamp were set here, there were smaller trees in the place, or perhaps fewer or none. For this is a young wood, and if you look, the iron post is old. And they stood looking upon it. Then said King Edmund, I know not how it is, but this lamp on this post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen the like of it before, as it were in a dream, or in the dream of a dream. Sir, answered the other three, it is even so with us. And what's more, said Queen Lucy, for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find strange adventures, or else some great change of our fortunes. Madam, said King Edmund, the same foreboding stirreth in my heart also. And in mine, fair brother, said King Peter. And in mine too, said Queen Susan, wherefore by my counsel we shall lightly return to our horses and follow this white stag no further. Madam, said King Peter, therein I pray thee to have me excused. For never since we four were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any high matter, such as battles, quests, feats of arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given up. But always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me we should be ashamed if for any fear or foreboding that we turn back from following so noble a beast as we now have in chase. And so say I, said King Edmund. I have such desire to find the significance of this thing, that I would not by my good will turn back for the richest jewel in all of Narnia and all the islands. Then in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if ye will all have it so, let us go and take the adventure that shall fall to us. So these kings and queens entered the thicket, and before they had gone 20 paces, they all remembered the thing they had seen was called a lamp-post. And before they had gone 20 more, they noticed they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And the next moment they all came tumbling out of a wardrobe door into the empty room, and they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting clothes, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide from Mrs. Macready. In fact, Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they had never come into the empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of his wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believed the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route. Nor would the coats be much use by now if you did. Oh, what's that? Yes, of course you'll get back into Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone unless you find they've had adventures of the same sort themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know, all right. Odd things, they say. Even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? And that is the very end of the adventures of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, and he was, it was only the beginning of the adventures in Narnia. And thus concludes The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, just to clarify some questions that you might have after reading those final pages, no, the professor is not Aslan. He just happens to know some of those things that might have been said in Narnia, which definitely leads us to believe, even though he never outright confirmed it, we have a strong suspicion that the professor has probably been to Narnia at some point in his past, believing Lucy from the very beginning, then not being upset that the coats were gone. It's like, you left them in Narnia, no big deal. And then somehow knowing that line about once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia, something that Aslan had said to the children when they were kings and queens there, knowing that they couldn't try to get back, that it would just happen when they weren't going to expect it. All of those clues lead us to believe that he has been there before, even though he never officially confirmed it. But no, he's not Aslan or any other character that we met. If you really enjoyed this book and you would like to continue the story, my recommendation is to read Prince Caspian next. That book continues the story of Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, and I won't tell you much more than that to avoid any potential spoilers, but Prince Caspian is definitely where you'd want to go next. Now, one other thing. This is one of 7 books, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, in the Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis wrote all 7 of them. Now, for me growing up, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe was the first book, followed by Prince Caspian, and then the other 5. In newer sets of the books, you will see that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is actually number 2, with The Magician's Nephew being number 1. Now, early sets of the book had The Magician's Nephew, I believe, as number 5 or 6. I always get that one and A Horse and His Boy confused. Voyage of the Dawn Treader was 3rd, Silver Chair 4th, and then A Horse and His Boy, Magician's Nephew is 5 and 6, and then The Last Battle is number 7. The reason that they have slightly different numberings is The Magician's Nephew was written later on. So as these books were being published back in the early 1950s and then throughout the rest of the time that C.S. Lewis wrote them, he wrote The Magician's Nephew much later. But he wrote it as a prequel, kind of like with the Star Wars movies where episodes 4, 5, and 6 came out first, and then a couple of decades later, George Lucas eventually made episodes 1, 2, and 3. So even though they took place before the movies from the 70s and 80s, they were made much later on. It's kind of the same situation here. So if you look at newer sets of the books, it will often have The Magician's Nephew as number 1, and then The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian as 2 and 3. If you happen to find older sets, you might see The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe as number 1 instead of The Magician's Nephew. So that's just a little bit of explanation for why you might see slightly different numbering among sets of the books, basically just depending on whether they were numbered in the order that he wrote them or in the order that the stories actually happen. Either way, they are all excellent books. I highly recommend reading the series if you enjoyed this one, but definitely pick up Prince Caspian next. Hopefully you've enjoyed our Read Aloud series of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Have a good one.